gang. So this has been a long time coming. We have Jonas Nix here, who's graciously given some of his time to pause from working on your stuff. So I got to apologize for that. I'm sure people are like freaking out right now. Why isn't Jonas working on my rap? Because the guy's allowed to breathe a little bit. This is something that I have tried to get going almost, I think, since like March or April. And just because Jonas has been so busy, and that's your fault, it has taken up until now for us to be able to sit down with him and have a chat. So that's what we're going to do. So Jonas, welcome for coming in. Welcome. Thank you for giving me the time, but also thank you for giving everybody else the time that is very curious to hear your thoughts. And so welcome.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
The first question is, do you just run Modusworks? Is that your primary income, or is that like a secondary job?
That's a really good question. So initially, started the business as totally a side venture, where I was just curious and naturally just want to learn. I'm a curious person. I want to learn as much as I can about any given subject. It could be something different next week, but I fell into machining somehow. I always wanted a lathe, so I got a wood lathe, and then me and my brother, we made some duck calls for a while, and then I ended up with a metal lathe because I was fascinated by metal machining instead of just turning wood. And then I ran into a guy that he's a friend of mine. I ran into him and I told him I had a lathe, and he was big into knives. And he said, "Hey, since you got a metal lathe, you should make some lanyard beads." And that's kind of the origin of the entire thing, is lanyard beads. So I made those for probably a year or two, and then somebody asked me after I made beads and sold those for a while, just totally on the side. Made those for a while, and then somebody asked me to make some buttons for a spinner, and so here we are. It's just kind of grown from that. Yeah.
Was there any sort of family influence, like anybody else into machinery before you got into it? Like parents, father, grandfather, uncles, aunts, anybody?
Yeah. So I actually visited my grandfather recently, and I thanked him for encouraging curiosity. I remember staying with him when I was a child, and I had questions. I always had questions. I was always a very curious child. I always took things apart to see how they worked. My mom, she always gave me a hard time because I took stuff apart. But one day that shifted, and I was able to put stuff back together and fix things that were broken. And then my dad built furniture for a long time. I was always exposed to welding because he was always fixing whatever broken with his furniture business. And then he transitioned into cabinet making. And so all this machinery in this giant shop, I've been exposed to machinery. I'm not afraid of machinery. I'm also not afraid to get my hands dirty. I'm not afraid to try something. So that has served me well. And then, I don't know, this is just some weird progression that led me into metalworking, where now I'm not a trained machinist. I just I'm curious, and I figure this stuff out. And I remember when I started out turning those lanyard beads, I scoured the internet forums and stuff, and like, well, now, this encyclopedia of knowledge is available to everyone. Of course. The internet, yeah. Right? And so I scoured the internet, and I wanted to make a titanium lanyard bead. And everybody said on the forums, they said, "Oh, it's not even worth the trouble. It's hard. It work hardens real easy, and you'll break tools, and it's just a headache." I'm like, well, these other people are doing it, so why is this guy saying? It's kind of like a gatekeeping thing. The machining forums, either they didn't know or they never tried themselves. So I'm like, okay, watch me. I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try. I'm going to see what I can do. And then you learn from there. You end up burning up, cheap drill bits. So you end up learning how to source the correct tools to be able to cut the material that you're working on. There's just so much to learn. And that gatekeeping stuff is, it's problematic, but also um, I can be proud of the fact that even though I read that and saw somebody else's either experience or just their um, ignorance of the fact, of what can be done, led me to ask questions and go further. So hopefully that
So
makes
it's
sense.
well, yeah. So it's safe to say then, maybe in your case too, it was the challenge. Like the
Hmm.
challenge pushes you to innovate, right?
Absolutely.
Not so much I need to come out with something new or I need to do something new, but rather, hey, can I do something
Yep.
new? And then if someone tells you it probably can't be done,
I'm gonna
then
try.
you're pushing forward and saying,
Yeah.
"Well, watch me do it," or at least I'll fail miserably, but at least
Hmm.
I'm not one of the people that just randomly says it can't be done.
Right.
When you first got into, so you went with lanyard beads, right?
Hmm.
And then at some point, you would have sort of been made aware of the fidget community. And I mean, I feel like knives are always kind of a natural progression into fidgets. I
Hmm.
know a lot of people, including myself, started basically stumbled across the fidget community by watching knife reviewers. And then all of a sudden, like for example, like left EDC, like with Kevin's stuff, like I started off because I carve wood as a hobby. So I got into carving knives and they're very specific. But then I went down this rabbit hole of knives, stumbled onto his site, and all of a sudden he's talking about fidgets. And then I'm looking at other fidgets, and then you get into the, well, maybe I could buy this, and then you find the premium world of fidgets, and you're like, holy shit! Like how could I ever afford that? And the next thing you know, you're ordering one, and so that like I can see that as a natural progression from the knife community.
Hmm.
But so for you, like, how did you even kind of get into this? Was it just like lanyard bead, and then you went, what else can I do with this? Or
Yeah.
was it just being exposed to the knife community?
Okay. Thinking back, I remember so I have a lathe now, right? I've made these lanyard beads and then I wanted to make a top as well. I didn't know that tops, these very well machined, high precision
Super
tops
precision,
existed. Had no idea.
right?
But since I own a lathe, I am scouring YouTube for lathe videos. I want to see what other people are making. So I stumbled upon uh, a video made by Jim Skelton. I don't know if you know who that is, but Jim Skelton
No.
was a big knife reviewer years ago. I'm not sure if he still does reviews. He transitioned to knife making, and I haven't kept up with him since. But so Jim Skelton exposed me to Rich Stadler of Billet Spin, right,
Okay.
and Gavin Sexton
Yep.
of Dynamic Inertia. Joshua Dawson, I forget his name of his business, but Joshua Dawson is awesome. Gavin Sexton, awesome. Rich Stout. These are all friends now, right?
Right.
This it's weird when you think back. Like, gosh, these are people that I completely were unknown to, and then they were rock stars, complete rock stars to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they are
Yeah.
making and selling these very high precision instruments. Um, but now I can call them friends. It's cool. Um, and
And now you're on stage with them.
yeah, somehow I don't know. I'm just a dude. That's
Right.
it's weird, but I do realize that people see me different. They see me differently than I see myself, and I have to remain cognizant of that. But that's a whole nother subject.
Well, we'll
Um,
get to that subject actually.
yes, okay.
Yep.
And then so yeah, there may have been another maker covered in his video, but anyways, so I buy a top from Rich, and then Prometheus Designs, or not Prometheus Designs, it's Prometheus. It may be Designs, but anyway, it's the Lambda top. So that was the first top I owned, and then I bought one from Rich at Billet Spin, and then that progressed into that got me kind of in the gateway of EDC at large.
So up until that point, when you started getting into tops, were you kind of getting to know other fidgets like spinners and sliders and stuff, or was it just tops still? Like, were
It
you
was still
aware of the fidget
it was still
community?
just tops, and I would have to go back and look at my Instagram to be able to see the progression, but that would be a good catalog and a good a good timeline. You could tell where I was at in the progression based on the feed of my Instagram.
Right.
I can't remember if I did tops and then stumbled into the spinner scene,
But
or
I
if
mean
it
more
was
like
vice versa.
were you thinking just about tops, or did even when you
Yeah.
were buying tops, were you still aware of other fidgets existing? Like, did you know
Nope.
about sliders? Did you know about spinners? Or
I
was
don't
it
think.
just like, oh, cool, these are tops. These are kind of neat.
Yeah, I don't think the slider as a concept existed yet. Um, and then I was just into tops, and then the gateway into fidgets was the button situation. So someone asked
Okay.
me to make a set of buttons out of a certain material, um, for his torque bar, right?
Right.
So I made a set of buttons, and he sent me the torque bar. And I said, this material you're asking me to work with, I can't even afford to buy this material. He said, oh, that's fine. I'll just buy some material and I'll send it to you. And then if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, whatever, no big deal. But I had made a few buttons out of brass, right? But he wanted me to work with Damas steel. And
Okay.
then little did I know, Damas steel is much, much harder to work with than brass.
Yeah. There
But
must
he
have been a
said
pretty big technology
there's a
research.
huge learning curve there, which
Yeah.
again, my nature, I figured it out ultimately. And then the etching and all that stuff. There's just so much to learn there, but it's stimulating
Right.
for me. So I was totally in. I was not like I was making any money on this stuff. I was just turning around and buying more tools. That was my ethos at the time. It's like if I sell so many beads, then I can buy this tool to be able to do this operation or buy whatever. But I wasn't
Just going
pocketing
back to
any
the
of
challenges, right? Like you're
exactly.
being
Yeah,
challenged. Can I work
I
with this new material?
yeah, I must be stimulated. I have to be stimulated in
Right.
some way. I have to be learning something. I have to be challenged with something. Um, so yeah, did the buttons, and then the guy came back after I sent him the set of buttons. He said, "You can keep the rest of the material. That's just your payment for making me the buttons." I said, "Okay, cool, nice trade." So then I kept the material. I ended up with like 3 to 4 inches of the same material. It was like ungodly expensive, over $100 an inch for the material.
Wow.
And he came back to me and said, "Hey, these are great. Do you think you can make some more for a friend of mine?" Okay, so I just made the rest of the bar, and then turned around and sold those. And I was like, there's something here. There's something to this.
Right.
And then more and more people ask about it. So I had multiple people, just people post. Spin Space was the thing. It was the big thing back then. Post a set of the
Yep.
buttons up on Spin Space, and then everybody come out of the woodwork wanting a set of buttons like that. All right, so I made a larger run, and then demand got out of hand. Spinners were crazy back then. It was just a
Yeah.
huge influx of people to the market, and there was not enough to go around. So I ended up opening a pre-order for buttons, and
The
I told my
dreaded
wife,
pre-order.
yeah, and I didn't know any of this. Like I didn't know
Right.
how much work.
It
I
makes
knew how
sense,
much.
right? On paper, it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense on paper, and I knew how much work it took to make one set of buttons, and like, you can sustain a high level of attention and a high level of um, just strenuous activity for a short amount of time. And I knew how
Yeah.
long it took me to make one set. I was like, okay, yeah, it seems like a profit margin on this is pretty good. Let's see. Somebody suggested a pre-order, I think, and so I did a pre-order. And then I told my wife that night when the pre-order was going live, I said, sit down, just sit down and watch. It was on my laptop at the time. So sit down and watch this, and let's just see what happens. And so like go live, hit the go button, and then about 3 to 4 minutes later, I had sold $25,000 worth of buttons. So I cut it off.
Right. Because that's amazing, but terrifying at the same time.
Terrifying. I was terrified.
Yeah.
Absolutely
Absolutely. And people
terrified.
don't understand what that means, right? Most people
Right.
are like, holy shit, 25 grand. And you're like, holy shit, I have to make
I have
25 grand worth
people's
of stuff.
money I have
Yeah.
people's money that they have trusted me with to make the product that I said that I was going to make. But now
And you're
we've
one
got
person.
so many and I'm still working as a nurse at this time.
Wow.
So I'm just doing it in my spare time, right? So yeah,
Wow.
that was a eye opening experience, and then it just grew from there. Like it's just, and I've made the same mistake a few. Well, it's not really a mistake. It's just a lot of mental stress,
Well,
physical
just
stress
to put
also.
it,
My left knee. So I stand that this green machine. If you can see this green machine right here,
yep.
it's facing this towards the wall, like that angle right there.
Okay.
So you can't see the whole machine, but that machine right there is what I have made all the spinner buttons on. And you stand there, and it's a strenuous activity. It doesn't seem like it would be because it's a machine tool, but there are forces involved, and you have to
Yeah,
brace
you're
your
exerting
body
your
in
body.
certain, yeah, you have to
Right.
brace your body in certain ways. My left knee is absolutely wrecked from the way that I stood at that lathe for, gosh, years. There's no
Yeah, I
telling
can
how
imagine.
many sets of buttons I made on that machine.
You know, if we can just go back for a second and just sort of
Hmm.
put it into context, do you remember the number of buttons that first pre-order like what did that 25,000 represent in terms of how many orders?
I don't remember. Let's see. I do remember it was around 25,000 when I decided to cut it off. So that would have been around 140, 125 to 140 sets of buttons.
140 sets of buttons. So,
Sets, yeah.
and it took you how long to make one set? Up until that point, right? Up until you launched the pre-order, how long did it take you to make one set of buttons?
Um, so, well, it's complicated because you've got,
Roughly.
yeah, you've got the material prep stage, then you've got the actual first operation where you're machining the back side of the button and
Mhm.
threading it and cutting it off, and that takes maybe, I would say, in Damasteel, probably 10 minutes or so, and then so you have to make a whole bunch of the back sides, and they're completely flat on the other side where you parted the material off. Then after you've got all your back sides made, then you go back and you do it in a batch for production, and this is all manual, all manually machined. And then go back and change the setup to where you can take that button and flip it around and machine the face, which takes probably another 10 or 15 minutes per set, right? Then you've got machine parts that are finished. They're finished machine parts, but it's Damasteel. You have to etch it. You have to etch it. You have to polish it.
Right.
So probably another 15 minutes per set to polish, maybe less, maybe 10 minutes to polish just to make sure, and then QC everything and make sure everything looks nice. And then the etching process takes hours, or it can take hours, it can take
Oh,
minutes.
wow.
It depends. It depends, and you're usually doing that in a batch as well, but I keep the batch size small to where if anything goes wrong, I don't lose everything.
Sure.
So that can take a matter of, it could be 30 minutes, it could be 2 hours. It depends on how used up your acid may be from previous cycles. You just kind of have to monitor it. It's a lot of babysitting. So
Do you remember how long then it actually took you to get that first run out? Now, I'm sure obviously it's not like you started on the first one and didn't deliver anything until the last one, but
mhm.
that run of that $25,000 worth of product, like how much of your life was taken up to do that? Because that's the other thing,
um,
right? A lot of people think right away, oh, it's money and these things take like half an hour to do, but it's still not necessarily sustainable
mhm.
if it's taking, because these are typically like these are works of passion, right? In a lot of cases, you're not just like cranking it out and going screw it, next. Like it
Yeah,
takes a while. You walk away from the machine, you come back. There's prep,
yeah.
there's all that stuff. So, what did that take out of your, like what did that take out of your life?
That was, I believe, if I remember correctly, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks, something
Six to
like
eight
that.
weeks. Wow.
Yeah, that was my projected, like 6 to 8 week um, time frame that was projected, and I believe I hit that. I don't think I went over on that first pre-order.
It's also important for people to understand that you had $25,000 in orders, but that doesn't mean you cleared $25,000. Like, people tend to forget about the material, but not only the material, but the cost of the machinery that in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
cases is being financed over time. So, I'm not going to ask you how much you made on that, but just to say, when people go, holy shit, he made 25 grand in 2 months, it's like, well, no, like that's not the clear profit, because you've got materials, you've got, and again, most people forget about the machinery costs, like especially when
Mm-hmm.
somebody puts in a new machine, your profit just drops to zero because now you're paying off that new machine, and it takes like time to pay that thing off. So in a lot of
Yeah.
cases, it's more of an investment, right? Like the money
Mm-hmm.
goes back in to pay for something new. So was that, and again, without me asking, because it's none of my business what you actually made off of that, but in that moment, there must have been the moment with you and your wife when you're watching these sales and you go, holy shit, what do we do with this?
Mm-hmm.
And is it, they listen, we need a new couch, we need new counters, we need appliances, or yeah, but then again, if I take that money, I can reinvest it back into what we're doing, and then I can get better machining, or I can whatever. That must have been a pretty interesting conversation in that moment, I would imagine,
Yeah.
because again, this was a hobby, right? You were starting off.
Right. Totally.
So yeah, so it must have been that moment, like, do you take it? You like take the money and run, meaning obviously you make the product, but you use it to be like, shit, we can do this trip we've wanted to do. Or
Mm-hmm.
you're like, okay, whoa, this might be something big. I should take the money, reinvest.
Yeah. Yeah. A large amount of that money went to materials. The
Right.
materials absurdly expensive. A large amount went to tooling, as you mentioned. One tool that I use specifically for parting off the buttons. If it ever work hardens and galls and then gets stuck, it'll rip the entire top bottom of that tool off, and then it's useless. And those are $350 a piece.
And how
I
often
use
does that break?
not super often, but if you have like a lapse in focus, then
Okay.
it's more likely to happen, right? If you're paying attention, usually it doesn't happen. But if you have any sort of lapse or you're not feeling good that day and you're not in it, then that can happen more often. So I probably used a couple of those tools throughout that process of
Wow.
producing those that particular run. And yeah, as far as the money and where it goes, um, I did not take any money from the business until I decided to go full time, which would have been a couple years later.
Okay.
Um, so all the money got reinvested back into all the stuff you see behind me, and then there's
Right.
another. You see about 1/3 of the shop here, and then
Okay.
continuing that way, there's a bandsaw, two Bridgeport mills, um, all of my finishing equipment, uh, buffers and
Can your camera
sanders,
rotate
and
at all?
it can, but it's an absolute nightmare over there.
Dude,
Um,
everybody's shop, I've never once talked to somebody who went, oh, my shop is super clean right now.
my boat is there
So,
too, but
so,
there's more
and this
stuff
is
over
in,
there. It's just a nightmare.
so is this in your garage? Like, was this your garage that you converted
This
into your shop?
this is a cool story. So this shop actually is my dad's furniture business warehouse. So when he was making furniture,
Wow.
they had a warehouse. It's 40 feet by 60 feet, and this is just where they stored the product. And well, it was my dad's and my grandfather's. They were kind of in it together. My dad made the product. My grandfather would buy some from him and sell it. So this is where my grandfather stored his furniture, and
Okay.
then sent it out to wherever he did. He spent a lot of time on the road delivering stuff and all that. But so yeah, I bought this property from. Um, it was my grandparents' place, and then my dad and my aunt inherited it, and then I purchased it from my father and my aunt, and so It's a total of 6 acres. I have a rental property next door, which was my grandmother's house, and then there's 2 massive shops on the other side of that. So those shops are in disrepair, though. They really need to be torn down or at least fixed. But these are things that will come in time.
And do you live near the shop? Are you
I
on that
live,
property?
yeah, I live about 5 minutes away.
Okay, so it's like a 5 minute drive, or what? Like, is it just, it's easy then to get to work then? So this is
Yeah.
where you spend your day. Like this is
Mhm.
your work day
Yeah, this is
in
work.
the shop.
Yeah, I go
This
to
is work.
work. Now, there was a time, um, so I started out and we lived in a different house in between where I live, which is Jasper, and Birmingham. There's a town called Dora. That's where we lived. And we had a house. Me and my wife bought a house, and it had a 3-car garage in the basement. And so the business actually started there. It was in that basement, right? And then after I went full time, I ran out of room in that basement. Um, and I'm trying to think. Yeah, this all happened pretty quickly. I went full time. We bought another house here in this town that we live in now, which is not far away. I moved all my equipment into a large garage. So the reason for buying that particular house was because it's an old barn is what it is. And it has a long side of it that I was able to line my machines up and not be so
Okay.
cramped. So I moved to there. And then I bought this machine right here, the one behind my
Okay.
head, if I can
Yep.
turn the correct way. I bought that
Yep.
machine, and it actually went in that barn, which was not
And
heated.
what is that?
That is a CNC mill.
Okay, so is that where the
That,
wraps come out of?
yes.
Got it.
Yep. That's it. So that machine, very expensive compared to any of the other equipment in the shop. That was in my barn. The barn was not heated or cooled or insulated or anything. It was very drafty, and on hot days I would open the doors. On cold days I would close the doors and run a one of those um, one of those forced air propane heaters, and it would still just be freezing anywhere but except for where the heater was pointed. A lot of work was done there for a few years, and then I had an opportunity to purchase this property and moved everything over here, and it's just kind of grown. It's just grown little by little. I do not invest or I invest everything back into the business, or I did for a long time, and then of course when I went full time that changed. But up until that point, I had just continually reinvest every dime that I made back into the company, and then was able to build it to the point where I could sustain stuff like this. And like this shop, building it out was not without heartache. You know, moving the
Right.
equipment is not without heartache. All these things take time and money, and there's stress associated with that. And just moving the CNC machine from one shop to the other is multiple thousands of dollars just to have the machine moved. So you
Right.
kind of have to position yourself in ways that can allow for that. And I try not to take so much risk. And then that speaks to another situation with um, just people complain about like supply versus demand,
Right.
and
Like the
the
pre-order
growth.
versus the
Yeah,
lotteries and stuff.
growth doesn't always there. The thing with it is growth is positive in most cases, but you don't is there's a saying around here: you don't want to get too big for your britches, right?
Sure.
So you don't want to outgrow that. There may be a temporary spike in demand, but if you meet that or exceed that, then everything falls apart. And you have no one else to sell to unless you keep it interesting, unless you keep making something new and interesting, which I try to do both. I try not to get too big for my britches, and I also try to keep it new and interesting.
So I mean, speaking to that then, because there's a couple of points sort of within that statement you just made,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's interesting. And the first one obviously is the um there, for anybody who's been on the sites, I mean, we all know that there is kind of there's turmoil or there's drama that starts around the pre-orders versus lotteries or whatever you want to call them. And I mean, obviously, it always results in you can't keep everyone happy all of the time, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be a set of people that are fine with it. There's people that and I mean, obviously, too, this is typically it's not born from malice. It's from people who really love your product,
Mm-hmm.
but it puts you in a position where um, the demand starts to become unreasonable, right? Like it's
Yeah.
almost like the rabid want of I must have this thing, and why can I not have this thing now? Um, Seems to get almost not well like overly dramatic, but very negative. Like it casts this weird kind of negative cloud over something that people tend to love.
Yeah.
So that's got to play a role on you mentally, where like if you get to the point where you're like, I mean, how do you even decide that other than your health, right? I would imagine the health is the only thing that determines your decision there. But
Yeah.
like recently, you had to close down the cell group
Mm-hmm.
because things were kind of getting out of hand. And I think that probably cooled stuff off, or it sent
Yeah.
out a good message to people. But that mustn't have been an easy decision even to get to
No,
there.
no, not at all. It. So like I've learned as I've gotten older. I started the business when I was like 27, 28, right? No, I would have been 30, and then I'll be 37 in March, right?
Okay.
And I like to think that I have learned over time a lot of different things, um, but I've learned that my mental health, if I'm not in a good headspace to do what I do, um, it's just not going to work. And so I prioritize mental health, and I also prioritize my physical health, and I
Right.
also prioritize, above all, I prioritize my family, um, because I have two children, and I'm going to be available for them. I'm going to be available for my wife. So it is what it is.
Right.
And then also, people say, well, just get more machinery, get more people to help you. And I'm a person by nature. I do not ask for help very often. And then whenever I do ask for help from people, they know that I truly do need that help if I'm asking for it. But I don't ask for help, and I have a hard time letting go. I have a hard time letting go of control over my product because I'm very emotionally invested. It's as weird as that sounds. I'm very emotionally invested in my product, and I want to keep the quality top
Sure. Of
notch.
course.
So that's kind of where I come from, and I don't know, the even thinking about expanding or growing or biting off another chunk of debt like that was for years, multiple
Right.
years. And it reminds me of, I listened to an interview with, are you familiar with Steel Flame?
No.
Steel Flame makes a lot of really cool cast bronze and cast silver EDC stuff. Really,
Okay.
really cool stuff. But I remember listening to a documentary that was made, and Derek Obitake is his name, is the owner of that business. And Derek said that you have to be aware of the fact that it's very easy to create a machine that you have to feed, meaning that your
Yep.
overhead can very, very easily get out of hand to where instead of making products as a passion, making stuff that you feel led to make and making things that you find interesting, you are then just trying to move a large amount of product just so you can cover your bills. And that's what I
Sure.
want to avoid because I've been
And
there, and I inadvertently did that. Even knowing, even having the benefit of listening to him say that, I still did that because a short history of spinners. Spinners were hot, super, super hot. And then the market peaked. And then it cooled off. And
Sure.
there was a point at which, just in the ergo line, 1,500 spinners easily, right? So you saturate that market, and then the demand overall in the entire space, the fidget space, the spinners cooled off. And in the midst of that, I had purchased that machine to
And
make that line.
you've built an
You've built
entire
an
structure around that
infrastructure
product.
to
Yeah.
support this market to a certain level, but that level doesn't hang around. So then you're kind of left.
And you're like, what
And
the
you're
hell do I
just,
do with all this equipment?
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was tough. It was tough to make it through that. But here we are. We're on the other side of that, and I've learned, and uh,
Well, so let's
I don't want to stick my head back on the chopping block. We'll put it that way.
let's talk about that then for a second, because there was at some point a transition then obviously from spinners to sliders.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was that what prompted the sort of the change, or the new product? Like, how did you go from spinners, especially at that time when you know a lot of makers probably just washed out, right? Like,
Yeah.
sell off the equipment, just be like, well, we can't do this, I'm financing this gear, or something, it's a lease, or I've purchased it, I'm making payments, let's just get rid of it and move on.
Mm-hmm.
So when that happened, is that the point where you went, well, I'll try something else? But then again, how do you do that? Because to try something else means you have to buy a new type of machine to make that new thing.
I
So
actually just utilized I just utilized the tools that I have, and pivoted, and instead of having to buy a whole new machine, I just changed the way that I set up my work holding for that machine right there.
okay.
And I don't know if you know about it, but there was a kind of a transitional product there that it wasn't super popular because it was so expensive. It was hard. It was hard to make, difficult to make, and difficult to make well. And but it was an I love the product. It was called the Tavy,
The
and the
Tavy.
Tavy
Okay.
was a fidget that had a ring bearing where two body halves could, and it had magnets, had 6 magnets on each half, and it would click when you rotate those two body halves around one another. And then
Okay.
also it had a R188 spinner bearing in the very center, and then you could spin it as well. So it was a transitional, like, it's kind of like a spinner, but it's not really a spinner. It's more of a fidget that also spins, kind of adding something to the spinner's bag
Yeah.
of tricks to try to pull sales. It was kind of like a Hail Mary, like, let's try this. And there was a conversation with my wife. It's like, I just don't know. I just don't know if this will continue. Like, do I just close the doors and try to hold on to what I got? Or do I, sell out, like completely quit, or what do I do? So this is one of those things that was able to help me make a transition into something that would sell. Because when I tell you, and people like, the customers are going to see it very differently. They'll say, yeah, it seemed kind of cold, but I never left spinners. True for you. But from a sales standpoint, spinners were cold. I'm talking cold.
Sure.
And you try different things to try to stimulate some sales. But when the old tricks that you tried didn't work, like doing different materials, offering many options, all this stuff, usually that'll help generate some sales, because people feel like they can get what they really want if you offer many options, right? So that usually can help stimulate some sales. But when you do that and you don't get any response, really, or very minimal response, and yeah, there are people that were supporting me throughout, but it's not enough to sustain. If it's not enough to sustain, then you're left having to go some other direction just to try. So I tried it. So Hail Mary, Tavy, and then it kind of staled out. But then in the meantime, I'm having these ideas about people complaining about certain products, having complaints about sliders and how either the magnets break or they have sticky performance. Okay, so that's what led me into the slider
Okay.
market because they were getting hotter. There was a perceived demand there that I felt like I could maybe tap into, but we're going to try. This is my thought process, is that I was going to try my best to alleviate some of these issues that people are having with other people's products. So here we are.
When you designed like the first Wrapped, I mean, there's so many things that went into play, but like how long was that process before you ended up with a product you were happy with,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually getting to the Wrapped itself, like sort of saying, okay, this is the one. This is the one
Mm-hmm.
that I am locked in and I am moving forward with this. What was it like with those first sliders? There must have been a very long phase of testing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you're trying stuff out. You're probably showing it to your wife, and she's going, I guess, this is a thing that's
Yeah,
like gonna be. Maybe it's
exactly.
anything like my wife when I get new
Yeah,
fidgets, and I'm like, babe, try this, and she's like, yeah, and then she
yeah,
hands
yeah.
it back to me slowly, like I'm a 6-year-old, and she's like, I don't get it.
I love
So, and that's from someone who only reviews them. So I would imagine for you, this is part of your sort of financial security rests on these things that
it.
she's
Mm-hmm.
kind of looking at and going, I don't get it, which has to be a pretty hard buy-in, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
for sure.
so that switch into sliders there must have been so many factors sort of sitting on your shoulders to get this thing right. Um, what was the process of just kind of getting the first slider out where you were like, okay, this is good, I'm happy?
Yeah. If you want to talk about like the progression was long, and if you're going to talk about the Wrapped, you have to talk about the WMW, which was the Watch'em-a-Watsit, which was a very small slider.
Right.
If you're going to talk about the Wrapped, you have to talk about that one because the idea for the Wrapped plate being what it is now came from it was a accident. It was an accident on the Watch'em-a-Watsit. So I made the
Can we talk for a
Watch'em-a-Watsit.
second about the name? Because where
Yeah,
did that name come from? Because
I
I
don't
notice
know,
also the
man.
spinners are like that, right? Like you've got spinners that are like the machinima thing and the like all these things. And so I love the idea that it was just like, I don't know what the hell to call this. It's a
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Um, and so even that name, like, did you just kind of come up with the name, or did you go through variations of the name? Like, how did you even get to
Um,
that?
I like little tidbits from different people. Every person, you are a result of your experiences with every
Sure.
person that you've ever met. You take a little piece of everybody that you ever meet, or everybody that you ever see, like your videos or whatever. So there's a channel on YouTube called AVE.
Okay.
And this guy does tool reviews, and he also got into some machining, and he's just a very like hands-on guy. He's an engineer, but this is just his fun side project. So the Spinema thing, that name came from it's just a term that he uses a lot, and I thought it was so cool, and I didn't know what to call my spinner. I call it the Spinema thing, and
That was
then
great.
every other thing after that was just a variation on the same
It was
thing.
born off of that.
Yeah, yeah. And then Watch'em-a-Watsit actually comes from another YouTuber. His name is Alex Steele, and he does blacksmith work, which I've done a little bit of. So he does blacksmith work, and he's from England, and he has a very particular way of talking and uses a lot of interesting words. So I took that word, and I'm like, man, I'm just gonna own that. I'm just gonna use it. So it's just
So
taking inspiration from other people, and not. And one word that comes to mind, we use whatchamacallit sometimes.
sure.
And I'm not sure if that's regional or if that's all over the
Yeah, no,
place.
that's a
But
pretty common, like
yeah,
whatchamacallit. Wasn't there was a chocolate bar at one point in the 80s, I
yes,
think,
yeah,
called
that's
something
right.
like
Yeah, yeah.
that. Okay, so let's go back then. So you were creating the whatchamacallit, which is like the whatchamawhatsit,
Hmm.
right? For the
Yep,
first slider.
yep.
So what was that process like then? From the point where you're like, maybe I should get into sliders to getting to the point where this thing is ready. I'm ready to post
Mhm.
this and sell this as a product.
Yeah. So the whatchamawat's I wanted to trying to think of how many points I wanted to hit when I was creating it, but I wanted to fully enclose the magnets because I did not. Uh, I tried making a slider that had exposed magnets that you press in, like on the Tavy. Those magnets were pressed in, and then the problem with magnets is there is a wide range of tolerance. No matter where you get magnets from, there's always going to be a wide range of tolerance on the size of that magnet. So if you order a 1/8 diameter magnet, if you put it on, if you check it with a caliper, some of them will be 0.123 inches, and then some of them will be 0.126 inches or 127 inches. And
Right.
machining, you're generally dealing with a tolerance of plus or minus 1,000. And
So it's
so
very
that,
precise.
yeah, that range falls out of a press fit tolerance. A press fit
Sure.
tolerance is usually zero clearance to negative 5/10,000ths, something like that, to have a nice snug press fit. So then I resorted to gluing in some of the magnets, which is one of the reasons why that thing was so expensive. And so I tried to make a slider that had press-in magnets, but the tolerances were all over the place. So some would fall out, some would be too tight and break. So even the assembly process was just a dumpster fire. It was not going to work. So I'm like, okay, we're going to fully enclose the magnets somehow. I don't know how yet at this point. And so I'm like, okay, let's design a 2-piece clamshell thing that encloses the magnets. All right, cool. Then I make it, and then it's rattly. The magnets are moving around all over the place. And then again, on the tolerance, thicknesses of magnets are going to be all over the place tolerance-wise. So even if you machined the part perfectly to sandwich those magnets tightly, there's still going to be tolerance issues, and you're still either going to have one sit higher than the other. And we use multiple magnets in a slider.
Right.
So then I had to come up with a way to leave space inside this shell, and use a material to compress those magnets and sandwich them together that allowed some variation in that tolerance, right? I'm like, well, heck, if we're going to do that, then I wonder if I can set it up to be able to change the magnet setup, the magnet structure, the number and the strength of magnets. This was all things that were just going through my head. So that's where the insert idea came from. And then how do we attach those two halves or those two pieces together? Well, I used screws. I used 4 screws. And so the 4 screws on each half was very fiddly. And so you think about the shortcomings of the whatchamawatsit, and then you can kind of see where the wrap was better in every single way imaginable from the whatchamawatsit. The thing that led me to the wrap design being a 3D contoured plate is I inadvertently made the plates, when you clamp them in the vise, it actually bows the material, right?
Oh, okay.
All right, so when you clamp it, imagine you got a vice jaw here, vice jaw here, it clamps the material. Well, the material is going to either bow up or bow down with that pressure. And then you machine that flat. You machine that flat, and it's completely flat in the machine. But the minute you unclamp it, it's going to bend one way or the other. All right. So now we have, I didn't know they were bent. I was just like, okay, cool, it works. Cool, let's do it. Let's sell them. And they worked great. And then I get reports back from people talking about how the plates only wear on the edges. And they say,
Right.
man, I just don't have any sticking issues with this slider. I don't know why. And then I just thought about that. Why is it doing that? Like, I know why the material is bowing, but why are they not having any sticking issues? Well, one, I did go with a material that I thought would have good lubricity and good anti-galling performance, right? Which was bronze.
Okay.
And I just kept thinking more and more about it, and I started looking very closely and shining a light. Like, I have a light lighting my face here, and using that light to look through and see like why why is it sliding so well? It's a limited contact issue. You have,
Sure.
if your plates are too flat,
There's too much friction.
there's too much friction. They will naturally stick together. I don't know if you're familiar with any machinist tools, but there's a thing called gauge blocks that
Okay.
are precision machined. They are accurate to like plus or minus 1/10,000th, which is 4 decimal places, right? And you can actually take those two precision machined super flat surfaces and you can ring those plates together. You can ring those blocks together. It's just a little chunk of steel, but it's super, super flat. You can ring that together and they will stick to one another. You cannot pull them apart. You can maybe break them apart, but you can't physically pull them apart. And you have to wring them back apart from one another. You have to slide them apart from one another. The reason they're sticking, there's a lot of physics that goes into. I've researched it at length, but they say it's either van der Waals forces, which is how geckos use their fingers to climb on any surface known to man, and then there's a theory that the materials are just so close together that they temporarily bond together, which I don't really believe in that. So, but whatever. Physics can't hardly explain it either. So here we are. But yeah, I imagined that plates at large in the industry were too flat, right? So then I purposefully designed a plate that had limited surface contact. 3D machined plate that had limited surface contact. So in each wrapped plate, there are 4 points of contact. And then that as an opposing 4 points of contact. And then it has a smooth transition from those points to where anywhere along any position along its slide is going to have limited contact and therefore little friction. So that's, again, the Wrapped was born from the Whatchamawatsit and a complete screw up. Like just totally by accident. And then I fleshed it out.
So let's talk about that for a second. So we go from the Whatchamawatsit, the Spinema thing or the Machinima thing to the Wrapped. So how did the name, how did you get that leap from the whatever thing or what's it to something completely, because in terms of branding, right, obviously from an advertising and branding point of view, if you had already established a brand of this kind of naming structure, this fun kind of naming structure, which is like implies, I don't know what it is, but it just does a cool thing and it's fun and whatever. Who needs a name, right? It's just this cool thing. So we go from that to a very, very specific name, right? Which is the Wrapped, which of course, like, like if this is the meaning of it, like, if you're enraptured by something or it's fascinating, it's beautiful, it's, like, so that jump to that name, how did you get to that name? And why did you not want to carry through the naming structure that you had already established?
Because the product was different. It was totally different in its inception. It was totally different in the amount of absolute, just the absolute attention that it got from me in its design and its whole progression from, I made 3 or 4 different prototypes, not of the Wrap, but of different things that were trying to accomplish the same thing, but nobody will ever see those because they weren't good. So 3 or 4 things in between.
Are they still around?
And the Wrap. Yeah, they're in a bucket somewhere. Like,
yeah, I'm sure people would love, somebody out there, man, wants that. They're going to be big.
But yeah, these were things in between where I was trying to make something work and it just wasn't good. And I don't remember exactly how long I was just completely absorbed. And that's where the name comes from, is because I was completely absorbed with making something good, making something that just works. It just works.
So the name actually then, which is really cool then. So the
actions through its inception. Yes.
It's your perception of what this thing is. So it's almost describing your state of mind while creating it.
Absolutely, 100%.
That's very cool. That's really cool. It's not often that a product gets named based on the creator's experience, right? Usually it's more of like an outward thing of what's the customer going to experience when they use it, or
Hmm.
people's perception of it. So seeing that was born from kind of your out of your chest, right? Like this is how you
Yeah,
felt when you were working on it. That makes even more sense. And then that actually speaks to why it's such a not a very common word, right? Like it's
yeah.
it's an unusual word, and it's spelt even the way it's spelled.
Hmm.
With that T at the end, for a lot of people, probably throws them off if they're searching for one, or they think it's a raptor,
Yeah.
from like Jurassic Park or something.
Hmm.
Um, so that's actually really cool that you kind of managed to create um, this piece and this name, but it's based off of your feelings that went into it. It's almost
Hmm.
like you poured your a little part of your
Absolutely.
soul went into it.
Yeah.
Um, so well, let's talk about for a second then. So I think there is, and I've said this to the other makers that I've spoken to, that I've interviewed, there are clearly a couple of different levels, and those levels are starting to become a little more blurred. But usually we have kind of like the I'll call them the premium, like the ones that sit at the top of the community, the ones that everybody's always after. And those are, there's probably like the top three, right? Which clearly like you're in. And I think everybody, like we say this all the time, but we've got like you're up there. We've got Magnus, and we've got Compiform, and we've got like the three that everybody loves to have, and those are always sitting there. But the uniqueness of yours is that yours is I find is the most personal for people, because they can literally modify it and have you shape it to specifications that nobody else can allow, right? Like you can literally say I like this material because I really resonate with this material, and then they can buy it and send it to you, and if the material works, you'll create something out of it.
Hmm.
So I think one of the this kind of ties into a bit of also the um not fanatical in that sense, crazy, but fanatical in the original sense of the term, which is just fans of the work. But I think you have such a strong fan base, because not only is the product obviously fantastic, and it's one of the most widely known kind of fidgets out there in the community, but also it's one of the most personal for people, because they're getting part of their soul put into each one, because they get to choose what they want.
My favorite inlay material is micarta. That was when I decided to do inlays, that was kind of my vision, is just to add interest and add contrast to this product. It just adds visual interest, and also micarta is a very grippy material. If it gets wet, it's still grippy. It's used on knife handles for that reason.
Right.
So that's my favorite material, because that was what my original like go to. Like,
It was my Carta.
yeah, it's just like, and it's utilitarian. Like it doesn't. You can scratch it up, and it looks better somehow.
Sure.
So I like micarta best. Um, the hardest material that I've had to work with really is Fordite, which Fordite is um, layers of paint that have fallen on the fixturing when they're painting cars. And so you can
Okay.
imagine layer upon layer of paint stacking up and then getting baked repeatedly on these fixtures. So it's beautiful layered material, but it's
Oh, wow.
also brittle, and it's also
Right.
and then there's things in between. So there's very brittle paint. Also, there's very flexible paint. Older paint was more brittle. Newer paints, because of the way the way cars have evolved into having these plastic bumpers, so the paint has to be flexible. So you can have any degree of that in the material that you get, because you don't know where your material is actually coming from. So it's either brittle and chips real easily, or it's too flexible and actually is hard to hold flat in the machine when you machine it. So you end up with thin edges, or inlays too small. Or I built a vacuum fixture specifically to cut Fordite, and that way instead of being held in a vice jaw from the sides, it's held down by vacuum
Oh,
pressure.
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, which is it's a common thing in machining with people machining softer materials or things that are very thin. Vacuum fixtures do exist, but I had to design one specifically for my inlay shape. So yeah, Fordite's the hardest to get dialed in, and then still you may think you got it, and then you close the doors and hit the go button, and like this set now didn't turn out like the last set you did, and you're like, why is it different? And you end up wasting a lot of material, and the material is extremely expensive, dollars per gram of material. I have decided to not even bother with tungsten anymore, um, because it's so rough on everything. It eats the tools, which is one thing that's very expensive, but it also is very hard on the machine itself, the entire machine. Um,
Okay.
it wears the machine. Whenever, like, if I was running tungsten right now, you couldn't even hear me. You would not be able to hear me because it's so loud. Think like
Mm.
jackhammer type noises
Really?
and level of noise. Yeah. So that's one
Wow.
thing I've written off. Let's see. I've never done any stone or any mineral containing material because it's so abrasive. It's just not, you just can't. Ceramics, there's certain things that just don't fall under the umbrella of things I can machine. But then there are things that I do choose not to machine.
Well,
Um,
let's shift then, because I have a question about, and this is always a bit more of a touchy subject for people, but I do find it tends to be defended more by the customer base and the audience than the maker themselves, because you almost never hear the maker themselves talk about it. In terms of similar shaped sliders and things that kind of pop up, um, I feel like there's a point, kind of like in cars and stuff, where there are only so many shapes you can go after or you can create before we start to see those same things reproduced by other people. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally. If they see something that works, and they might kind of go after that and go, well, that worked for that person, I'm going to just tweak it a little bit.
mhm.
What's your position on almost not copyright ownership, but trademarking of a shape? Like, do you feel like shapes can be owned by the designer? When you see a slider that pops up that's similar to a wrap, do you go, well, shit, that looks like just like one of mine? Or do you more kind of go, well, I mean, I guess like it's going to happen, right? People are going to do it. What is your position on that, if you even feel comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, I mean it is a touchy subject, and
Sure.
um, it's it's there's always going to be people that one to one completely rip off a design, right?
Right.
And then there are people that are going to toe that line and get it kind of just right up close, but then be able to say, no, it's obviously not the same thing, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I do tend to draw the lines when something is just almost on the nose, just just almost on the nose, where it takes. Design is very intentional. Design is very intentional. Every single surface, every single detail was thought about and modified and changed and programmed to be machined. So I have choices as a designer to choose the way something looks, the overall look, and also each individual feature. I choose that. And
Right.
it doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes from my brain. So, yes, I do feel ownership over certain things and how they look. And like recently, there was one where the features were altered slightly, but overall, the same shape was the same as a raft. So, yeah, I'm gonna feel a certain sort of way about that because each feature was like it was from here,
Right.
and I took what was in my brain and put it on paper. And then there are people that are going to say there's nothing new under the sun. and that there's only so many ways, you said it, there's only so many ways that you can make something and make it look different from the last thing. But if you are creative, I truly believe if you are creative, that you can make something unique and you can make something that is your own, and you can make something that is different from anything that has been made. There's always something that you can do
to differentiate.
that is your own. There are so many ideas that I have that have not made it to production yet.
Right.
I always, for every one thing that is seen by people, I have them lined up 6, 7, 8 things at a time that I could choose to produce. Either I don't because of time constraints, or I don't because I'm not ready for that yet, or there's always something else. Nothing that I have made. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything that I have made that truly looks like something else that somebody else made. The spinner in itself, Scott McCoskey created the torque bar, correct?
Right.
He created the torque bar, so he is the godfather of spinners, right? My spinner looks nothing like a torque bar. My original Spin-A-Ma-Thing spinner looks nothing like a torque bar, but it's still a spinner. Everything, I did talk about this with someone else the other day, that I feel like everything that I've ever made, it takes a concept and adds to it. And I think that's the way innovation is supposed to work. Like the Spin-A-Ma-Thing spinner, it added thickness, it added depth, it added larger buttons, it changed a lot of things. And larger buttons didn't really exist on spinners. Most of them were pretty small. Trying to think.
It became a feature.
Yeah, it became a feature. And I'm trying to, let's see. Rick Zerafeud, he made larger buttons. But like the Spin-A-Ma-Thing was sort of created in a vacuum. And so was pretty much everything. I try to create stuff in a vacuum, not influenced. Of course, you're gonna be influenced. You're
Sure,
not
it's
taking.
like making music, right?
Yeah,
Like you
exactly.
hear other songs, and there's only
Absolutely.
7 notes to choose from, so
Right.
there are going to be similarities.
Oh man, that's such a great illustration, right? Your
Yeah,
example is a great illustration. How there's always new things to be made. There's always variations on a theme that can be made. But like, I feel like it's lazy to say, oh, there's only so many ways you can make it. If you're into
right.
music, you know that that's bull.
Yeah,
There's not,
considering
there's,
how much music has been created off of those 7 notes, right?
it's in the
Over
same,
history.
it's in the same vein. It's in the same
Yeah.
vein. So I love your comparison there. That was fantastic.
Your thoughts on collaborating with people, because I see, we see more and more collaboration between makers and stuff, and obviously the 3D makers kind of are coming into the scene pretty strong, where 3D used to be considered kind of entry level, and now they're just the technology that goes into them and stuff, like they're now kind of moving up. And of course 3D printing tends to be an easier vehicle to collaborate with, because I guess it's just sort of easier to get an idea realized. But it typically, like, you're still sort of dealing with 3D, unless it's like in the case of like with the Magna stuff, with the Verk and all that, with the Cladis. But do you ever kind of look at people collaborating and go, that might be kind of cool to collaborate with somebody one day? Or is it the opposite, where you're like, again, in a lot of cases, you have control over your product and you know exactly how it's going to come out, and all of your focus is there? Whereas if you go down the road to collaborate, next thing you know, that's a left turn that, you could be 6 months into trying to figure this out. And maybe that's a distraction from Modusworks. Like, do you ever see collaborating? Like, is that something you would ever see yourself doing?
Yeah, I've done a few collaborative things in the past, and I've not really, like, like Nick at FTO, me and him, we communicate back and forth a good bit, and I consider him a good friend. Like, we talk, and he is we have come up with, gosh, Nick is such a freaking rock star, because you'll have an idea about something, and maybe you send him a file, and then the dude just makes it happen, right? He just, like, okay, here's your prototype. Wow, that's incredible. You're a rock star. You're a machine. And so, yeah, I've collaborated with him in the past, and also he has made parts for me. But as far as collaborating on a design, it's really hard to, things that 3D printing has an advantage in that you can make any shape that you really want to,
Right.
and you don't have to consider how it's made, because it's printed in these levels, and you can have different features than are allowed with machining processes. So also, anyone that is to collaborate with a maker, let's say a designer wants to collaborate with a maker, there is a lot of bouncing back and forth, because
Sure.
designer will have ideal, and then maker or machinist will have an idea, and then designer sends said drawing to maker, and maker says, oh man, this just isn't going to work, can you change
Yeah.
this? And
Right.
then the designer says, well, what about this? They're like, well, that's better, but this is going to have to be different. And there's a lot of back and forth there that I'm
It's
not
like an
opposed.
architect planning a building versus the engineer going, well, you can't do that. Like, that looks
Exactly.
cool, but that
Yeah.
can't be done that way.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And like, it's a known long-standing argument between, like, say, welders and engineers. The engineer says build it this way, and the welder says, well, you can't do that, like, I'm the
Right.
guy running the stick here, the same thing. So it's a lot of bouncing back and forth, and I've not really hit I'm not really nobody's ever asked me really to collaborate in that way on a
Well, they
on
might
a
now after you saying that.
in-depth design thing. But then, even then, how do you decide? Like, if you go in collaboratively for this project, I'm used to a certain profit margin on work
Right.
that
Yeah,
I do.
exactly. Whose product is it to sell at that point?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Whose is it? Who owns that? Do you just double the price? You jack it up and say, no, you can't do that, because that's not fair to the customer. So, um, I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And I've listened to Rich at Billet Spin. He has the same concerns as me, and he has pulled off successful collaborations with people. And Christopher Bathgate being one of them most recently. It's not out yet, but that's one thing that's coming from him soon. So, yeah, whose product is it to sell? That's a very good question, and that's the big question mark in the air.
Right. So that I could see that as being almost a headache to avoid, and it's just easier to avoid than to even get into it. Right? Like, sometimes it's just easier to say, I don't even want to bother. Like, I don't want to even
Yeah,
get into that. Because
yeah, it's not necessarily an impasse,
it's not a true
but
partnership, right? In the sense
right.
that, yes, you can kind of work together to design it, but at the end of the day, in your case, you're the one building it. You're the one
Hmm.
still kind of, that last 60% of the job still lays on your
Right.
on your shoulders to kind of send out. So I can imagine that would be like a touchy conversation, or
Yeah.
100 of how does this work?
Yeah,
So
and I mean, and you do come across people that are very, very easy to deal with, and um, it's. I know that some other makers have taken people's ideas and just basically made it happen, and then, not really, the designer not expecting any share of the profit or anything like that, and that's all well and good. But as far as from my standpoint, I don't really do that. I don't think like that, because I am like floor sweeper, trash taker outer, machine runner, designer, shipper, packager, QC department, finishing department, you know, all these things. And I like wearing all those hats. And I don't really like giving up that control over the design aspect, especially. But yeah, I'm not saying no. I'm just saying like it's just out of the realm of my it's not my wheelhouse.
Yeah, it hasn't, the right scenario hasn't come to you yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. Is there anything kind of on the horizon where you're like, well, there's something else I've been thinking about. I'm just kind of waiting for the right time to do it or to drop it. Or is this it? Is it the wrap and the spinners and, you know, maybe a couple small things, but we're not really moving into new products at this point?
Yeah, I'm not really moving into completely new directions as far as fidgets go. Like I think about concepts all the time, and I have, you know, 100 things on my desktop in Fusion 360, which is my design software and manufacturing software. And like I have 100 things in there that that could be made, but it's like, how do you know that one concept is going to take off or not? And to make something new requires a large investment, because usually it requires different tooling and different setup and all this stuff. And I don't see myself, I don't know, like you said, nobody knows the future, and I don't see myself doing something completely new for a decent amount of time, because demand is where it's at. And I'm going to do let's face it, the reason I'm here and the reason all this stuff exists is because the people that are watching this video and the people that don't know about me yet, you know, all the customers, past, present, and future, are the reason that I'm here. And so I need to do them a solid by following through on providing them the product that they want. Right now they want wraps, so that's what I'm doing. And I'm actually running at like max capacity getting those out. Of course, it still takes time. The things are just time consuming, and that's okay. I designed parts that are kind of difficult to make, but again, that's okay because it's worth it for me. I have the people to thank for supporting me through the years. And so if they want something different, then that's what I'll give them. But right now, that's what they want, and that's what I'm going to give them.
So, dude, I cannot imagine a more perfect ending to this whole thing than that last statement. So I am not going to ruin it. I am not going to change anything. We're done. That was perfect. So to everybody out there, what a wonderful message to end off with for the people who love what you make. So I'm just, you know, I'm so thankful that you have taken the time away and that you've kind of stopped doing what you're doing, to sit down and chat. It's an honor to be able to pull you away and to have your time like this. And I can only, you know, I can only hope to see more amazing stuff coming out of your shop. And I know that, you know, there's no lack of love for it. So again, thank you. Thanks from the community, and thanks I'm sure from everybody watching for the stuff you're making, and to know that it does, you're not just making a toy, right? Like you're making things that connect with people on a lot of different levels. So it's what you do. And I mean, as funny as it may seem to people who aren't familiar with this, what you're doing is important for people. So we'll just leave it with that, and end this on a great note. So thank you so much, Jonas. And at some point, I'd love to, you know, in the future, catch up with you again and just see where things are going.
Sounds great, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And again, can't thank the customers enough because they're the reason. They're the reason.
They are. They're also the reason that I'm doing this, right? Like,
awesome.
They're watching too. So, okay, awesome. Well, thanks for watching, gang, and hopefully you enjoyed this. And if you have any comments for Jonas or myself, just leave them down below. Thanks, gang.